Welcome back, everybody, all the familiar faces, and many warm welcomes to all the new people that are here. We would like to give you just a quick overview of things that have been happening and will be happening at NICO over the next couple of months. And then I'm going to introduce today's speaker, Joshua Jackson. So, Dan, take it away.
Yep. So hopefully thank you all, first of all, for coming out despite the bad weather today. As always, we typically get good turnout for these talks. So you're all aware of the Wednesdays at NICO seminar series. I think a highlight of what NICO does, and we've already had a couple of speakers, a number of speakers this quarter in the series. I hope you all come for the rest of them as well. Also, you should be aware of there's the NICO reading group if you're interested in getting together with others around the topic of shared interest to read about scientific publications and other works on the topic. That's one thing NICO runs. We also run hackathons or data science nights around various topics. So check out the NICO website for events that are coming up, and we'd invite everyone to participate more.
Right. Very good. Thank you. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Joshua Jackson. Joshua is an assistant professor at the Booth School of Business in strategy and in behavioral science. Before he got there, though, he did a postdoc at Kellogg with Adam Waits, and he does work on the coevolution of culture and psychology, really focusing on how changes in culture, think about religion, norms, etc., shape the way we perceive ourselves and perceive others. Work is very far-ranging. Joshua just got his degree 2 years ago, but he already boasts over 50 publications. And his work on evolution is already going into areas of coevolution of culture and machines and AI. He's got a really interesting paper on robotic preachers. I've got to read that one in more detail. The title alone has made me so curious. And he's won a whole lot of awards, including a very prestigious SAGE Young Investigator Award, or is Emerging Scholar, excuse me. And he's published, in Nature, Science, PNAS, and a lot of great journals. Please welcome Joshua Jackson. Thank you, Joshua.
Thanks for that really kind introduction, Brian. How's the mic? Sound okay in the back? And I have until 1:15. My only question to all of you. Okay, great. Let's make sure that the clicker works. I just came from another talk where none of the technology was working. Looks like this clicker is working. Yay. As Brian mentioned, broadly speaking, I study the coevolution of culture and psychology. And I've applied it to a few domains. And usually when I come and give a brown bag talk, I try to touch on these different domains of emotion, religion, ideology, how all of these things have changed over history and co-evolved with culture. And I try to introduce this emerging new field that I'm very excited about called historical psychology. Today, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm just going to focus on one of these domains, speak about the coevolution of social complexity and moral psychology, because I'm just trying to work out how a couple of findings I have might relate to each other, potentially turn this into a review paper. I think this is an ideal group to get feedback from. So it's going to be a little more rough around the edges maybe than a regular talk I would give, but they're ideas I'm excited about. I'm very keen to hear what everyone thinks. I'm used to people interrupting. Feel free to interrupt if you have a comment. Also, you can wait till the end. That's fine too. So we can start the story with this figure. This is a figure that represents a construct that's very common and popular in evolutionary anthropology called social complexity. About 70 years ago, 80 years ago, anthropologists realized that if you look across human groups, often you see a correlation of a whole bunch of different social and technological factors. So the groups that have bigger populations tend to be more urbanized. They tend to have writing systems. They tend to have more infrastructure. And this concept was christened social complexity. And in more recent research, folks have found that pretty much every region of the world, if you look at the groups that inhabit this region, there's been this dramatic rise of social complexity. So compared to humans 7,000 years ago, pretty much any group, any world region has bigger, denser societies than they used to. people tend to talk about this in quite long time scales, but I think this is still happening. So this is my great-grandfather, Fred Longbottom. Didn't have the luckiest name, but he had a great life. He lived in this region of New Zealand called Taranaki in a little town called Inglewood, about 200 people. He was the only police officer in that town. And everyone in the town came to his funeral when he died. And I've been back to Inglewood since then. And now, you can see there are lots of people living there, hundreds, probably thousands. I don't actually know the population. I'm not a very good family member, I guess. But I think about my life compared to his, I probably interact with more people in a given week than he interacted with in a whole year. And so, social complexity isn't just something that's been rising throughout history. Our social networks are still getting much denser, much bigger, even today. Today, I'm going to speak about cooperation in socially complex groups. Probably one of the most well-trodden areas of the social sciences. People have been speaking a long time about how to maintain cooperation in groups where not a lot of people know each other. Usually this is framed in terms of a free rider problem in groups where people can act relatively anonymously without getting punished. How do you maintain high levels of cooperation? How can you make people into good citizens? This problem has really deep roots, goes all the way back to Hobbes, Rousseau, probably goes back even further to Plato and Aristotle, trying to debate about the best way of managing cooperation in society, solving this free rider problem, also called the commons dilemma. These are all variations on a theme. And extended into more recent work on the tragedy of the commons and rules for the evolution of cooperation in groups. These are all trying to tackle this free rider problem. And if you ask me, 3 years ago or 4 years ago, I'd probably say that this theme captures my research pretty well. I was studying how tight cultural systems emerge that enforce social norms in big groups and maintain cooperation, especially during times of threat. And I was studying the way that religion evolves, punitive gods emerge, and maintain cooperation when it's hardest to get people to work together. So I was part of this big obsession, but I'm going to put that aside today. I'm going to say, I think that maybe we've been focusing as a field and as a body of intellectuals on the free rider problem and social contract ideas for too long. We've sort of figured it out in a lot of ways. And, we live in groups that are pretty cooperative, but we still face a lot of different kinds of cooperation dilemmas. And we've kind of neglected those because of this really long-standing focus on the free rider problem. So even in groups where people wait patiently at crosswalks and wait in line, sign up for jury duty, pay their taxes, you still have dilemmas that are faced by the average person. One of these dilemmas I call the sparsity problem. In a whole range of people you don't know very well, how can you find the most cooperative people, even in a group that is cooperative enough for society to function? And then the second problem I call the coordination problem. How do you find people who want to cooperate with you? And these are problems that can exist even if a society has solved the free rider problem. So who are these people? Anyone take a guess? No, this is NICO. These are all of the NICO faculty. I thought you would know this of all people. You can kind of think about this problem in terms of collaboration. Like these are all amazing faculty members. I could probably, start a conversation and develop some sort of collaborative idea with anyone on this screen. These are all really smart people. They all do good research. But you have these two problems. Who's the best person to work with? And who's the person who would want to work with me the most? So you can kind of think about this as a version of the problem. And what I'm going to argue today, this is like getting at the core of the thesis. So if you just pay attention for one slide, this is a good slide to pay attention for. What I'm going to argue is that moral psychology has evolved in at least two ways that are actually pretty counterintuitive to solve these problems that I've outlined. That we've responded to this sparsity problem with a more generalized view of moral character, and that we've responded to a coordination problem by adopting more polarized moral values across groups. Okay, and I'm going to, throughout this talk, speak more about the nature of these problems, and I'm going to really dig into what this means. So we'll start with the sparsity problem and generalized morality. Imagine surveying your social network and figuring out who's good to work with in different kinds of situations. It might look a little like this. So person one, maybe this is Billy in the front row. He's a really brave fighter. He tells the truth. He's a responsible caregiver, but he's very selfish with his resources. So this is, whereas person two, maybe that's Curtis, also in the front row, brave fighter, but bad on all the other categories. This is a pretty good representation of cooperation in the real world. It's messy. People aren't just universally good or universally bad. We actually done pilot studies where we look at the correlation of cooperation across different contexts, regardless of whether context is real world behaviors like volunteering at homeless shelters or giving money to charity or donating blood, or cooperation across different economic games. It turns out this correlation isn't that high, between 0.2, 0.3, depending on how you set up your study. If you know everyone really well, you can calibrate your predictions about someone's cooperation based on your previous behavior with them. Maybe I was in a situation where I needed resources from Billy, and I know that this is a situation where I shouldn't trust him. But in bigger social networks, it looks a little more like this, where you might have one data point, two data points, if you're lucky, about your partners, and you have this problem of, what am I going to do in a situation where I don't know anything about them, where I haven't heard anything about them, where I haven't interacted with them before. And this is where I get into generalized morality, which is this idea of developing a lay theory of morality that actually doesn't map onto reality, where instead of acknowledging the fact that morality is complex, you just sort of average it across situations. What does this look like in the real world? This is the hypothesis. Generalized morality co-evolves in large social networks. What does this look like in the real world? This is Martin Shkreli. Everyone know Martin Shkreli, infamous for one thing at first, I guess. He raised the price of a prescription tablet from $13.50 a tablet to $750 a tablet. I'm sure that many of us heard about this one thing that he did, which is really terrible, but then would have no problem assuming that he's bad in all sorts of other ways, like he's romantically unfaithful, or he's disloyal to his group, or he's an irresponsible caregiver. And it's interesting that we'd be so fast to agree with these generalizations just based on one data point. So this is what I'm talking about with generalized morality. In Shkreli's case, it turns out all of these things are true. He actually is a horrible person in all these other domains, but in some cases it isn't. And I found evidence that people vastly overestimate how highly these traits will correlate across contexts when you compare their estimations to real world data. As I mentioned earlier, we suggest that this might actually be something that's co-evolved with social network sizes. That this isn't just how we think everywhere. Generalized morality isn't the default that we walk around the world with. It's actually an adaptation to living in really big groups. So I'll present you a little bit of data that suggests this might be the case. The first line of research I'll present comes from field data in the Central Rift Valley in Tanzania with Hadza hunter-gatherers. And the reason that this field site was so good to test this hypothesis was that the Hadza are one of the few groups who still subside primarily using hunting and gathering, but Hadza life is changing very quickly because of an influx of tourism and also a greater exchange between Hadza hunter-gatherers and the nearby city of Arusha, which is where you can go and get a part-time job, raise some money, go to school. And so what you have is actually a lot of diversity across contemporary Hadza hunter-gatherer camps, where in some camps, you'll have a lot of people who've gone into the nearby city and gone to school or held a temporary job. Or you have some camps where you have some people who got a visitor from the States. They learned about who Obama is and about television shows in a different country. And then you have some camps where no one's left the camp, where the social network has stayed very small. Any questions about this design or about anything so far? Okay. So what we did in this field study is we looked at out-of-camp exposure, which was our proxy for kind of how large these participant social networks were, whether they had kind of stayed in the band that they had interacted with most of their lives, or whether they had been either to the nearby city or interacted with ethno-tourists. So you can see some of the indicators here that we had. We had 10 of these. And then our dependent variable was how they ranked their campmates. So these were all people they knew really well. It wasn't like they were ranking people in the city that they had visited. They would rank 8 of their campmates on 5 different moral attributes. This is what the task looked like. These are a few of the attributes that we used. And this is a stylized case where I've got campmate 2, and I've ranked them as the universally the most moral on their honesty, their generosity, their effort towards the group, and how good of a heart they have. Actually, there's no word in Hadza for morality, something that I'll get to in a second, in a more general note. And so good heart was the closest we could come up with.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, question, yeah.
Sorry, I just had a really quick question. So are they living in the same camp with
What's that?
these? So the people who are being questioned, are they living in the same camp still, or have they moved out to the Moore City area?
These are people who, if they've left, they've come back.
I see. Okay, thank you.
And that's something that happens a lot. And it's worth noting that even among people who haven't left, sometimes they've moved between camps. And so that's why, there might be forms of social network size that we aren't capturing, but this scales pretty well with how many people participants in our study know. Any other questions about the design? Yeah, question in the back. Yes. Yeah. So the question is, do they rank everyone from 1 to 8? They do. This is a stylized set of rankings, which is absolutely generalized morality. So this person's the 4th best rank on all of these traits. Campmate 2 is the 1st. This person's terrible. They're the worst on everything. Similar to Curtis, I guess, in my other example. This would be an example of what we call localized morality, acknowledging that there's variability across these traits. Morality is complex. Someone might be really honest, but not as generous. The participants who take the survey, this is the first survey they've ever taken. Ranking is a much more intuitive way of evaluating your campmates. And so it's just, you can sort people in a pile much more easily than you can give people a 4 or 3 using the kind of scale that you might use in a traditional psychology study. Brian?
You know if 8 is a terrible person, do you? You just know that they're not as good as number 1.
Yeah.
So number 1 might be like an angel.
Yeah,
And number 8 might be, a little less of an angel.
it's true.
Is that true?
It's true. There was a range of attitudes in the qualitative data. So there were a couple participants who refused to rank people because they were so bad they didn't even deserve a rank. But it's true that it's all relative. It's an artifact of the procedure. I think that the conclusions aren't kind of susceptible to that as a confound, but it's certainly an artifact.
Okay.
Yeah, good question. I think I saw one more, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, these words, we did not use these English language words. These are the closest translations. And these were words that we pilot tested to have a similar meaning across the camps that we did the study. Okay, so here I'm going to show you what it looks like for subjects who are below the median on out-of-camp exposure and above the median. Here's what it looks like for subjects below the median. So you can see that these things are correlating. If someone is viewed as effortful, they're also viewed as having a good heart. And you can see this size of the correlation is about 0.3. And then this is scaled to the size and darkness of the circles there. This is for subjects below the median on out-of-camp exposure, and then this is for the subjects above the median. And so for all the correlations but one, they get larger in their magnitude. Actually, the largest correlations involve the good heart attribute, the most global of them. And if we correlate the standard deviation across the rankings, kind of how consistently participants ranked their campmates across attributes, you see a pretty robust correlation between the out-of-camp exposure and then this standard deviation. And this holds controlling for the demographic characteristics of both the judge and also the person they're rated. And here we've also controlled for spouse. In other models, we controlled for kin, whether you're ranking your family or not your family, and it doesn't really change the results very much. Now, this is a very specific population, a very specific world region. And so we've correlated this using a more traditional measure of generalized morality, where people answer items like this across world regions. So we've done this study in the United States and also in international sample. And we consistently find that the size of social network now measured through the size of your online social network for folks who have Facebook, and then the size of how many people you estimate you interact with every day, consistently predict this perception of generalized morality. Of course, there are all sorts of other things that might correlate with those social network sizes. And so we try to control for as many of them as possible: age, gender, religiosity, SES, education, country fixed effects. And the correlations remain pretty consistent. One of them doesn't reach significance anymore, but we see a fairly consistent correlation between people's social network size, both in terms of how many people they know online, how many people they know offline, and how willing they are to endorse this idea of morality as just being kind of black or white view. So this is some cross-sectional evidence for this hypothesis, but social networks don't just vary around the world, they also vary across time. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, the average person has inhabited a larger and larger social network across human history. And one prediction that we made in this paper is that views of morality may also have become more generalized over history. So this is the growth of the word morality in different European languages. Interestingly, morality is actually a very young word. It was a translation of Cicero's from Aristotle's Ethikos. So it originally meant something very different than it means today. It was translated by Cicero into Latin, and then embarked on this semantic drift where now it has this very generalized meaning rather than meaning a system of ethics. And as it's embarking on this semantic drift, it's also rising in its prevalence across time as Europe urbanizes and grows more populous. Yeah. No, you're welcome to. I'm at a business school. Yeah.
What you said is that the social network can vary more from
Yes.
another way to remember that one of them for more consistent financial actually you have less firm belief about how moral the person is, right? So and in the sense there would be more person there because you may I so
This is a really interesting point. So I think that since you're not mic'd up, folks on Zoom might not get that question. So I'm going to rephrase it and you tell me whether I've got it right. You raise the possibility that these results could also occur if there are different levels of certainty about how moral someone is, rather than different firm beliefs about generalized morality versus localized morality. So if I don't really know what Billy's like, I might rate him in either a more disorganized way or a more organized way than if I really know what he's like. Is this the question? Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I thinking about the small media now you can be seen in a certain way by everybody. There's nothing you can do to change that. This is a system in which, it's like I have this idea about not that work.
Yeah. It's a really intriguing point, kind of the familiarity of people in the survey versus the kind of exposure to larger social networks. I'm gonna talk about why I don't think that's what's going on, but it's just a speculation. So I think it's a point that's well taken. These are people rating folks they know really well. Like everyone in this study has known each other for over a decade. And then, in the surveys that we've done, even though I think surveys are an imperfect measure, this is speaking more about a lay theory of how morality is. So the fact that these align, I think, speaks more to actual different ideas about the nature of morality, or the nature of the people around you versus kind of your familiarity with these people. But the point is well taken, and we haven't addressed it. So I'm not going to have some secret slide that addresses this later. Yeah, Tessa.
The driving force is just sheer size of your network versus like polarization and diversity. I think this
Yes.
is especially strong if I start to make friends across political lines and age lines, all of those things, and then I have to resolve diversity, not necessarily that. So I can also develop a much larger network, but it's all the same.
It's a great question. So the question is about the size versus heterogeneity of the social network. I'm going to be speaking about heterogeneity of social networks and slightly different effects that might have on morality. I think that it's very possible that that's true, that the emphasis that people have on initial cues, that cue whether someone's good or bad, might be, people might give more emphasis to those cues in really diverse and socially heterogeneous communities where you need to make decisions about how to construct your network with more agency than if you're just kind of stuck cooperating with the same people. I haven't tested that yet, but that's something that I've spoken about with a few folks as a future direction for this. Okay, I put this on the slide. One limitation of this is that I'm just showing you one word. It could be that a whole lot of other words are increasing over time. This is what you get when you situate morality in English with other kinds of moral attributes. So it's not actually just shooting up in its prevalence. You see morality kind of has its heyday in the mid-19th century and then actually declines quite a bit. It declines alongside all other moral attributes. And this is actually the average word in Ngram is going to decline because there are just more words entering the lexicon. And the share that you see here is the frequency of all words. But relative to other moral attributes, morality actually experiences the greatest share of usage. And I think that what's happening here is really secularization. And if you look at more secular ways of people expressing generalized morality, those seem to still be very popular. And if you look at Google search interest, for example, for good person or bad person, this has increased at a really linear rate. I was blown away when I saw this plot over the last 15 years. Something seems to happen in 2006. Billy's theory is that this is when Twitter was released. And so we've tested this historical hypothesis in ways that don't just involve frequency because, words could be rising and falling for lots of reasons. It's hard to really know what's going on there. We've tested this using semantics. And so you can imagine a semantic space that involves lots of different moral attributes. And if there's semantic differentiation across these attributes, you could imagine a space looking like this, where you have some words related to fairness, you have some words related to disgust, you have some words related to harm, some words related to respect, loyalty. These are capturing distinct intuitions that we might have that we view as differentiable. Now you can put that on a two-dimensional space, and the hypothesis here is that if our view of morality is becoming more generalized, then what you would expect to happen to this space is a collapse in this semantic differentiation. This is the hypothesis that we've tested. We've tested it on pre-trained word embeddings models, word-to-vec models that were trained on Google Books every decade from 1800 to 2000. And you can look at the relative cosine similarity to words that are from the same moral foundation, according to a dictionary that was developed to capture different categories of morality, versus words that are from different moral foundations. And if there's this collapse in semantic space, what you would expect to see is that words from different moral foundations are growing close together at a greater rate than words from the same moral foundation. So I'll show you what this means. This is when you just look at the cosine similarity of a given moral attribute to all other moral attributes. And you can see that the average trend is positive. So these words are closer together semantically over time. There are a whole lot of reasons why words could be closer together in semantics over time. It could just be that the corpus is changing in its nature. And it's involved, there's more medical texts or more academic journals. And so moral language gets clustered closer together. It's co-occurring more frequently. So I don't put a lot of stock in this general effect. But what I do think is interesting is that the rate of this growth together, the rate of this semantic convergence is far greater for words that come from different moral foundations. So words like fair and words like loyal are growing closer together at a far greater rate than words like fair and words like impartial. So you can actually see this is a TSNE space where I've projected the embeddings from these models from 1800 to 1810, and then from 1990 to 2000. And you can actually see some of this differentiation losing its power over time. So here's fair and impartial, drifting towards the middle of the figure. Here's, all of these discussed words are pretty bunched up at the beginning of the model, and then they're much closer together at the end of the model. We've done the same analysis with a few different word lists. So this is emotion in 2000, and we don't see this same convergence, the same semantic convergence that we see in morality. You can see emotion still pretty granular. There's actually some evidence that personality is moving in the opposite direction, that personality is becoming more differentiated over time, not collapsing. And we think that this is really to do with the power of morality to predict cooperation and its invariance across different niches. That, if you're a pilot and if you're a plumber, there's one way to be moral versus competence, conscientiousness. These are things that are really growing more diverse in their meaning over time, depending on what kind of occupation you have, what kind of country you live in. And so it's not just that everything is collapsing over time. It's really about these traits that we use to predict cooperation. The paper just came out last month, so you can read it if you're interested. It has a few other studies and some agent-based models and experiments where we actually show that this generalized view of morality is functional for predicting partners that you know almost nothing about. And that takes me to the end of the first part of this talk, which is about this sparsity problem. Any questions before I move to the second part? Yeah. There's a mic being handed to you.
So do you mind, I hope this doesn't take too much time, but do you mind giving a little more detail on what the corpus was? And because, I think it was 1800 to 2000. And if you have any points in terms of the strengths and limitations of the corpus that you used?
Yeah, absolutely. We've done it with two corpora. I mentioned the Google Books corpus, the full corpus, English 2019 is the one that we used. We've replicated it in the Google Fiction corpus, which is smaller, but has more homogeneous content. So you don't see these big content changes. And what you see is that the effect replicates in both corpora, but this general trend upwards in semantic relatedness, that's only true in the Google Books corpus. So what I think is happening is that it's not that all moral words are becoming more related over time necessarily. It's really just the collapse of this kind of moral space. It's the cross category words that are growing closer together at a faster rate than the within category words. Yeah, and of course, there are big limitations for the Google Books corpus as well. It happens to be the best in terms of volume and historical coverage that we're using at the moment, but it's written by people who have the ability to write books, doesn't necessarily reflect the views of a representative sample of the population. And so those critiques are well taken. And we're hoping to do some work developing convergent corpora that we can use to test these questions. Definitely. Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, it's okay. The question is about looking at books from the same author and looking across a writer's career over time. So parsing out the cohort effect and the longitudinal effect. It's a great suggestion. I haven't thought about that until just this moment, but I think it's a wonderful idea. We are looking at stories in small scale societies. So the way that characters are described in stories. The volume of the data are a lot sparser in these data sets, so you can't train a big, reliable embeddings model, but you can look at kind of co-occurrence as something that you manually code in a character and look at those kinds of data.
I think one interesting thing of the authors would also be you could do more not stuck to things in English, right? Because you would have Spanish language writers that have long careers and stuff like that.
Yeah, the Google does publish non-English corpora that we haven't looked at for some reason. There's some debate about whether the quality is as high as the English corpora. I'm actually not the best person to ask about that because I haven't used the non-English corpora. But yeah, it would be pretty easy to test. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The question is about the interpretation of the cosine similarity measure. It's a standard measure in analyzing word embeddings for determining whether two words are semantically similar or different. It happens to do, it's related to the position of these vectors in space. So when the angle of these vectors is closer together, these are words that are used in more similar contexts with each other. Whereas when the angle is greater, these are words that are used often in more different contexts. So it draws from a hypothesis and assumption in linguistics, which is called the distributional hypothesis, that words that travel together have a similar meaning. And so the measure has been pretty well validated. There are some folks who prefer other kinds of measures, but it's, I would consider it the gold standard of folks who are doing this work, at least in the social science space. Yeah.
So my question is that use that model. This network and this model, they're all like trained with the so also the language reward. So the meaning of one word, 100 years ago, see different the meaning of the language nowadays. So how is it problem that you use is originally in network to analyze the language 200 years. Yeah, so that's my.
I actually think that's the phenomenon. I think these words are changing in their meaning and they're becoming less semantically differentiated. To the extent that people today categorize these things as separate categories of morality, speak to the fact that folks who are alive today think that they're semantically differentiable. But I think that what we're showing in this study is that that semantic differentiation isn't as great even today that as people think. And actually, you can predict the accuracy of these categories better in 1800 than you can today, even though people have picked the categories today. So it's actually quite remarkable that you're seeing this effect, given that these are categories that people have generated who are living today. Yeah, Tessa. There's the questions about whether there's a, I know I keep hearing people getting handed this. I don't think it's working. But it's a great question. It's about whether you might see an increase in the polysemy of moral words instead of just the co-occurrence. Another wonderful suggestion. I haven't thought about it, but yeah, absolutely. I think you would. Yeah. And yeah, there's data on polysemy from a variety of sources like WordNet, so we'd be able to test that pretty easily. All right, so in the interest of time, I'm going to move to the second part of this talk. And this is really about the coordination problem that I mentioned. How do I find people who also want to cooperate with me? And so the basis for this problem is that partner selection isn't just about finding someone who's cooperative, it's also about finding someone who wants to cooperate with you. So two really nice people could be having a conversation, but because they can't get on the same page, because they can't identify some sort of shared group, shared tradition, they can be talking past each other. So this nice man wants to have a conversation with a duck, but doesn't hit on the fact that they would get along until he speaks duck. The problem is that when networks become really integrated and the world becomes really globalized, the number of identities that we could potentially coordinate on when we seek to cooperate goes up exponentially. So this person, I don't know how many identities they have, but I'm sure they would be willing to work with someone who's similar to them on any of them. And also, if we overtly seek to coordinate on cooperation, this can exacerbate group decisions, the group divisions. So if I say, we both are from New Zealand, I want to start a collaboration with you, it's not really something that you can say. It's not a message you want to spread in society. And so this actually becomes a really big challenge. All these people that are potentially in this room that I think could be interesting, like, who am I going to start a conversation with? Who am I going to have the best conversation with? And it's both very difficult to figure out what I should be selecting on, and also very difficult to know if I can select on anything, at least overtly. What I'm going to suggest is that moral polarization across groups is actually critical to being able to solve this coordination problem in big groups. And one reason why this is it justifies group-based coordination. So it's actually quite easy to say, I'd rather work with someone who's also a Democrat, because we've morally polarized on what it means to be a Democrat and a Republican. And so there's overt discrimination based on political identity in the United States because of this moral polarization. People actually would prefer working with someone who's even further to the left or even further to the right than they would to work with someone who's a moderate on the other side. And what I suggest is that this is actually a strategy for being able to coordinate, regardless of whether people know it, being able to coordinate on group membership in really heterogeneous groups. We think that it's also a strategy that you can see at the national culture level. So when you look at international conflicts and the coalitions that form during these conflicts, you can see coordination on moral values, even when those moral values weren't necessarily segregated before a conflict occurred. So Putin has framed the war in Ukraine as a war against Western values, whereas Zelensky has emphasized similarity between Ukrainian values and US values. But if you look at the World Values Survey, Ukraine and Russia have the most similar values of any two countries in the world. And so you're seeing this moral polarization occur in a very strategic way today. The way that we've tested this, and I've been doing this work with Dan Medvedev, who's over there, a PhD student at Booth, who's been really instrumental in this project, is by looking over time as the world has globalized on variation across moral values and cultural values more generally. So here's responses to an item. Should children be encouraged to learn obedience? This comes from the World Values Survey, big survey of people around the world. Our analysis has about 500,000 people. And you can see that there's variation across countries in the mean response to this item. These are items that have all been normalized on a 0 to 1 scale. You can either look at the global mean, so what happens if you take the average of the averages, which is here, or you can look at the standard deviation across the mean, which represents kind of the polarization or the spread of the country means. And we're going to be looking at this standard deviation for this analysis. And there are two possibilities that you can imagine, that as globalization, travel, integration has occurred over time, the world's cultures have become more similar on these values. The other possibility is that they've actually become more different. The values have diverged. We did this for 76 countries from the World Values Survey that have participated in at least 2 waves. And we looked at 40 values that have been included in every single one of these waves and have been asked to all of the countries that we are sampling. You can see some of the sample values here. They cover a pretty big mix of domains. They also have a mix of scales. We've explored a few different normalization approaches to these scales. One of them is just min-max normalization, so everything gets converted from 0 to 1. Another strategy is median split. So that occurs for the extreme responding that people might have. Some people might just be more willing to agree with items in some cultures, but median split also loses a lot of granularity. You know, someone might earnestly think that it's very justifiable to be gay. Someone might be more on the fence. And then a very, very simple version of our analysis, just presented because getting into the gory details can get boring, but you can think about the independent variable in this analysis as being time points. You can think about the dependent variable as being the standard deviation of country means. And so are the country means getting spread further apart over time, or are they coming closer together? I'm going to show you what the results look like for one value, the importance of childhood obedience, this value that I flagged earlier. And now you can think about this standard deviation being represented both as the width of the distribution here and also the height of this line. So I've displayed it in 2 different ways. And I'm just going to skip through time. And what you can see is that the standard deviation is going up and up and up. And if you're going to actually correlate time with the standard deviation of country means, it would be a correlation of 0.94. Now, smart people in the room probably noticed something else that happened during this time, which is that countries got added. So it could just be that there's some sort of artifact of the sample getting larger, more heterogeneous over time. When Dan and I found this result, we actually thought this was what was happening. We thought it was a pretty simple explanation. So I'm just going to show you what happens to the effect when you subsample more conservatively to look at countries that have participated in progressively more waves, so you have less cohort effect, less turnover. This is the effect across all values. So you can see compared to the 0.94, it's smaller, but it's very robust. This is when you look at countries that have participated only in at least 3 time points, at least 4 time points, and at least 5 time points. So the effect size is remaining pretty stable. Then what we did is we took a sample of 32 countries that had reported at least 1 time point of data in the 1990s, at least 1 time point of data in the 2000s, and at least 1 time point in 2010. So there's absolutely no turnover in this sample. So a little bit of a noisier estimate because some countries are being compared across time, but it completely removes the turnover in the sample. And here you see the same effect, this movement towards value divergence. And you also see it if you normalize based on a median split approach. And you also see it with or without the demographic weights that are provided by the World Value Survey. So you could imagine that maybe they're just getting better at recruiting a representative sample over time. They provide weights for whenever they deviate away from a representative sample in a country, and you can use those weights. The effect actually gets stronger when you use the weights. And finally, we've controlled for continuous spatial autocorrelation rather than constant fixed effects, which is what we did in these initial models. Any questions about this? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, children should definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And he's very
You're about 5 slides ahead of me. Yeah. So the question is about whether it's actually kind of a segregation into groups that you're seeing, not just a polarization, but countries from the same region, for example, or countries from the same religious background might actually be segregating together. Yeah, hold that thought, and I'm going to show you what the answer to that is in just a couple slides. First, I want to show you what countries are diverging on. So here's our childhood obedience item that you just saw. Here's the 0.94 correlation, insanely high divergence. It turns out it's the 3rd most divergent value. The only 2 that are more divergent are whether it's justifiable to administer euthanasia and whether it's justifiable to be gay. Here's what the full sample looks like. And you can see a couple of things right away. First, most values are diverging over time, about 3/4. Second, it's really driven by these values at the top. And I've colored these, shaded these based on how relevant they are to a dimension called emancipative values, also called self-expression values. And these values are about tolerance of people who lead non-normative lifestyles, make non-normative decisions versus an obedience to traditional group norms. And so what you see when you zoom in on the means of these values instead of looking at the variation is something like this. In the 1980s, continents actually weren't too far apart on these values. So here's Europe in red, North America in teal, Asia and Africa are together. There's actually not a huge difference in these regions, but over time you can see this difference growing wider. And so wealthy Western countries, or right now we're just looking at European and South American and North American and Oceanic countries are breaking off in their support for self-expression values, whereas Africa and Asia are staying pretty consistent. Here's just one example of what you can look at when you look at a pair of countries. This is Australia versus India. So importance of childhood obedience, India is higher than Australia at the first time that each of these countries reports data. It's also lower on justifiability of divorce, but the means aren't that far apart. But by the last time point that each of these countries reports data, the means have broken apart quite a bit. What we actually find is that this is really driven not just by countries in Europe, but by wealthy countries in Europe and wealthy countries in North America. Brian.
Variation in Australia is greater than the between country variation
This is not looking at within country variation.
at all.
Yeah, this is just looking at the mean of those values. And so
First
this-
time reported, last time reported is not within the same country?
Oh, got it. Yeah. So yes, first time reported in Australia is more similar to first time reported in India than last time reported in Australia.
So Australia is varying more within itself
Mhm.
than it is between itself and India?
It really depends on how you answer that question. So it's varying more between itself than it was varying from India at time one, but the variance between Australia and India at the last time point is very large, a lot larger than the variation between Australia at its first time point and Australia at its last time point.
So how should we think about the in-country?
The differences between the means is what I meant to say. Yeah. Differences between the means. The difference between Australia's mean at time one and Australia's mean at the last time point is, yeah, is someone said the mean, someone's doing quick math. That's what I'm speaking about.
So how should we think about the relationship between the within-country variation over time and the between-country variations over time?
That's a great question. I can give you maybe an incomplete answer to it. And it's something that I'm thinking about a lot and Dan's thinking about a lot. What we find is that the more homogeneous that a country is at any given time point in its values, so both India and Sweden, very homogeneous within the country in their values, the more different they are from the rest of the world. And the more heterogeneous a country is in its values, South Africa is a very heterogeneous country in its values, the more similar it is to the rest of the world. It's pretty intuitive, but what it suggests is that what might be happening in countries like Australia is there were actually quite a lot of heterogeneity at the first time point in the survey on these values, and that sort of collapsed over time as Australia became wealthier, just time passed, morals changed. But you haven't seen that same heterogeneity emerging in non-Western countries, even those that have gotten wealthier. So Singapore and Hong Kong are two examples of countries that per capita GDP has increased about the same amount as, for example, the Netherlands, but it hasn't shown that same kind of spread of values that has shifted it towards more emancipative values. Yeah, no problem. This is speaking to the analysis that was just raised. Can you actually see kind of segregation based on different qualities over time? So this is a PCA of country means. So the country means are closer together in this space on two principal components if they share more similar values. And there's two basic PCs that come out of this. This one maps on pretty well to the self-expression and emancipative values. This one's maps pretty well onto like secular versus religious. So China, for example, highly secular, but sort of in the middle of the scale on the emancipative values. And what we're going to try to do here is explain why Japan is closer to Taiwan than it is to Turkey. And I'm going to show you what this looks like if we redo this analysis at every time point of the World Value Survey. So this is time point one. It's pretty noisy because it's the smallest number of countries, but you can see that wealth is pretty good at explaining why some countries are closer together than others. Wealthy countries are closer together in this value space than poorer countries. Here's what you get when you do the analysis for every time point. And you see a couple of things which we think are interesting. One of these things is that wealth remains the strongest predictor of value similarity. But over time, we see this effect where being close together geographically also emerges as a stronger and stronger correlate of value similarity. This is kind of explaining why wealthy Western countries are organizing in a different space than wealthy East Asian countries. Yeah. Increase in importance of similarity also be caused by the Yeah, it's an interesting point. I'm not totally sure that just increasing the number of countries would increase the size of these coefficients. The analysis is pretty similar when we subset as well, but it's possible. I don't want to rule it out until I've thought about it more. It's a good question. Okay. So there's a lot that's going on in this analysis. There's, decolonization in some of these countries. There's, overt distancing from Western aid, Western values. There is, a lot of action happening in Western Europe and changes in Western Europe happening. The fall of the Iron Curtains happened right before this analysis began. But what we see is one potential explanation of what's going on here is that as the world is globalized, it's become more important to kind of have moral differentiation between national cultures. And so it's not entirely surprising that national cultures have broken apart as they've tried to assert their own moral identity that they can use to coordinate on coalitions around the world. So I'm going to wind down. Got 15 minutes afterwards for discussion and questions, but just take you through the ground that we've covered. What I suggest is that because we've been very busy solving the free rider problem, we haven't thought about some other really interesting problems that happen in socially complex groups. One, which I've called the sparsity problem. How do you figure out who to cooperate with when you almost know nothing about the people around you? And then another that I've called the coordination problem. How do you figure out who you can establish a mutually cooperative relationship with when you can align on so many different kinds of social identities and it might not actually be favored or encouraged to align on social identity. And what I've suggested that there are two kind of ironic solutions to these problems, or I won't say solutions, I'll say responses to these problems. So I don't know if these things are solving anything. One response is that one ironic response is that as groups have gotten more complex, people in these groups have actually adopted a more similar view, a simple view of morality. And the second is that as groups have gotten more integrated, they've adopted a more polarized view of morality. I presented some pretty initial evidence for these two hypotheses. I know that they're pretty heavy hypotheses, and so this is just like intuition with a few data points so far. And what I think more broadly this might be indicating is a transformation of how we pick cooperative partners from more intimate, familiar-based predictions based on what I know about you from my friends, from my previous interactions with you, to using more superficial and indirect cues for figuring out how you might behave, even though I don't know you very well. And that using these cues might actually promote side effects ranging from moral overconfidence, thinking that we know how someone will behave in context when we really haven't observed them in those contexts, to intergroup conflict, polarizing on moral values that could potentially lead, in some cases, to conflict and political violence. I'll end with this book, Black and White Thinking. Sorry if you know Kevin Dutton, I really dislike this book. This is one that was recommended to me earlier this year, and I just decided to flag this quote here. "We are hardwired to discriminate and frame everything in binary black and white. It's how our brains work and have been for millions of years. Since then, the world has evolved," and then he goes on to prescribe how our minds need to be more complex to keep up with this complex world that we live in. I think that maybe it's the opposite. I think about, the groups that we've worked with among the Hadza. I think about, the town where my great-grandfather lived. I think people were a lot more nuanced in those contexts. I think that we had a much more contextualized view of morality, who was good, who was bad, who was nice to us, who wasn't nice to us. And I think that our view of morality now is a lot more binary than it was several hundred years ago. That's my own projection, but it's been fun to explore these ideas with you all, and excited to hear what you think. Yes.
So on the second part of the talk, you presented this comparison, which is contrary to what I'm going to say, with India and Australia, but the increasing standard deviation over time, I feel like that metric could indicate that there are holdout countries. Maybe there's a universal trend towards, let's say, increasing tolerance of misbehaving kids, right? Like less importance of obedience. And so some countries are holdouts and they haven't yet moved in that direction. Other countries have moved. That wasn't the case because you showed that India moved in the opposite direction, right? But is that a single data point, or is that like the curves you showed could equally well be flat? I guess there wasn't where it's not clear what the error bars look like.
Yeah, I don't think holdout is an incorrect way of characterizing what's happening, but I think there are different reasons to think that a holdout could be happening. So there's like one reason to think, well, any day now, these countries are going to westernize. And there's another reason that, becoming wealthier or, modernizing doesn't automatically produce more self-expression values. I think that a lot of countries do show a kind of flat curve. They haven't moved in the other direction, but I think that being flat actually means more now than it did 40 years ago. And so I'm in favor of the second view, that modernizing doesn't necessarily translate to self-expression. And I think that just remaining flat itself has been a form of moral polarization, given the way that kind of global norms have changed. I'll just tell you one analysis that I think is really interesting that I shared with some folks earlier. You can slice up the World Value Survey into the wealthiest, the middle class, and the poorest people in each country. So this is an analysis that Dan's been leading. And what you find is that cultural heterogeneity is greatest for the wealthy. So even within the countries, it's not like you have this elite class that is really leaning into emancipative values. They look very similar in non-Western countries to the poorest third. Whereas in the West, you see these big differences where self-expression values are much stronger held by the wealthiest third than the poorest third. Yeah.
My main question is about what possible mechanisms are for this. Like you hinted at maybe this reductionism idea. Is it that in heterogeneous, large social networks, people's like cognitive capacity is lower, so they tend to be more reductionist and be more generalized morality?
Yeah, it's a great question. I wish I had a great answer. I'm going to speculate a little bit about two mechanisms that could be happening. One is just that this is kind of the proximal effect is just that when we know people less well, we develop a more abstract construal of their character, and that this just happens to kind of be functional in big groups. I think that a complementary effect is that the function is actually driving a selection of words and concepts that emphasize generalized morality, like the word moral, which you don't see in a lot of hunter-gatherer groups, but you do see in old large languages today. So I think that there's been kind of a coevolution between those two mechanisms. But the reason I think it's an unsatisfying explanation is that that's just from here. I don't have data to support that, so I might be wrong. In the back. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Their role people versus non-group people, right? I can imagine, using a US example. So you have white people that are lovely and friendly and respectful and stuff like that to other white people, and then can just be the most horrible human beings against someone else from a different religion, a different ethnic background, or something like that. And so one of the things that I'm curious is about what are people answering to? In your kind of African context, it's very clear that they are answering about in-group people. But I would be interested, even when you are looking at more general analysis, if we are talking about in-group versus out-group. And I'm going to talk too much as usually, because I'm thinking about it's sort of, we are allowing in some cases more people to be in group, but we are always leaving some out of group. And what we see in terms of behavior against out group is pretty horrible, right? I mean, we can talk about Western societies being this amazing stuff, and then you think about what's going on with trans people right now, and you think, well, no, we are still the same shitty people that we have been for the longest time. Yeah. So I think that kind of capturing that would be very helpful, and maybe it would not make us look so good.
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot to unpack there. I absolutely agree with everything you just said. When you look at the value divergence results, there are different ways you can interpret it. You can say, well, look at these amazing, wonderful, angelic Westerners who are becoming so open. Or you can think about it, as we all have lay theories of what values are important to signal, what values are important to endorse that correlate to some degree with how we actually treat people in the world from our group, from different groups. I think that, really what the World Value Survey is capturing is people's lay theories of like what's important to say, what's important to hold, and that these are really signals even to yourself. And so what I don't want to say is that there are these global differences on how cooperative or nice people actually are, because I think that the evidence there is lacking. Yeah, and other than that, I would just be drifting into the territory of wild speculation. And so I think I'm going to cut my response there. Billy. There's a... Yes, it works.
Thanks. So my question is about the adaptive functionality component, and you didn't present the ABM stuff. So
Yeah.
apologies if I'm off here, but I guess so. I'm wondering about specifically your thoughts on the bounds of functionality for this, because with more complex and large social networks, a lot of things also happen, which is, or for example, like it's easier to signal a certain moral character and holding people accountable if they're false signaling. It would be harder if it's, you don't have as much information and there's more people, so it's hard to track everything. And so I assume that as generalized morality scales, it also becomes less inaccurate for any one person. And so at the global level, maybe there's these functions, but it could also lead to things like false polarization, which then could also have like group level consequences that we've talked a lot about. So I was wondering to get your thoughts on like the bounds of the functionality here.
Yeah, I don't think generalized morality plays very well with social media. And Billy's alluding to some work that we're doing on looking at what kind of content is promoted on social media. And people have a real attention and hunger for moral content, but it leads to often exaggerated views of moral divides across American society and across political groups. This is the agent-based model that Billy alluded to. It's a very simple model. You have agents playing trust games with partners in different contexts. So imagine this partner and they're really uncooperative in context one. They're kind of in the middle of the road on context three. And then I don't know how they're going to behave on 2 and 4. And in this model, it's regulated by 2 parameters. One, which takes the mean of the whole row. So it's collapsing across context. That's kind of the generalized parameter. And then one that takes the specific cell that the person's interacting with the partner. So for example, I'm interacting in situation 2, and that's the localized parameter. And what we find is that when there's no correlation across situations, so your honesty doesn't actually map onto your generosity, then generalized morality is terrible, it really drops off very quickly. That parameter is downweighted. But then as you start to increase the real correlation, then you see this interaction with social network size, where as people enter larger and larger social networks where they know less about their partners, then generalized morality lasts for longer until you eventually fill in this trait matrix and you know how everyone behaves. Now, this is a very abstract way of talking about functionality. And so I think it's very, very plausible that whatever functionality generalized morality actually had, that it may have been overwhelmed by other kind of conflict or polarization effects that are less functional. I think that you can also think about functionality in different ways. So you can think about the functionality, the adaptiveness of the person's strategy for predicting cooperation, but you can also think about the market for words and concepts in a large group where you don't know anyone and you're looking for ways of describing people. So I'm very confident that the marketplace for these kinds of ideas is only getting hotter. I'm less confident that the adaptive power of this way of thinking about morality has endured. Yeah, Curtis.
So I have a question about the nature of morality and what it is. Yeah, I wonder, I don't know if this is just a semantic distinction or something real. But it seems like, so you frame things as the moral domain. It used to be like more diverse, and it's grown more general. But I think maybe another way of thinking about it is morality is inherently black and white. That's what morality is. And maybe instead what has happened is these traits have become more moralized over time. become more related to morality than they were in the past. And say if like we took items from like Skidka's moralization scale and went back in time and administered them, people's moral convictions about those items maybe will be weaker and be like, actually it's okay to not be brave sometimes. That's okay. But now we're like, no, all these things are always bad. And that's just because they're more moralized than they were in the past. Is that a meaningful distinction or not?
I think it's a meaningful distinction. I'm not sure how different it is. Like, I think that this idea of a categorical view of morality where something is moralized or isn't doesn't quite probably map onto how these concepts work in people's heads. I think that also you look back at like rituals in medieval Europe and a whole bunch of weird things were moralized that we no longer moralize. And so I think that maybe it's kind of an orthogonal question that I don't have a good answer to, whether the moral domain has expanded. I know that in the political polarization work, there's been suggestions that instead of like segregating more strongly on the same values, we've just brought more values into the political arena. That might be true, but in this time scale of hundreds of years, I have less of a clear intuition. Okay, I can hear rustling, so I'm happy to call it a little bit early, and feel free to come up and chat if you have thoughts. Like I said, this is kind of early stages stuff, early stages ideas, but thanks for being such a great audience and for all the wonderful questions.